The first sign was silence. Not the absence of noise, but the collapse of everything that made noise meaningful. Radio towers dead, satellites blind, power grids failing in synchronized cascades. Planes fell from skies like dead birds. Hospitals dimmed, leaving ventilators gasping. There were no warnings, no signals intercepted, just a coordinated stillness that swept the planet in minutes. Half the world went dark. It began with the skies over Eastern Europe turning slate gray in the middle of the day. The clouds didn't move. Beneath them, nothing worked. Phones displayed static. GPS maps folded into glitchy spirals. Cars stalled mid-freeway. Soldiers couldn't reach commanders. And then they came, not with bluster or fire, but precision. The invaders weren't humanoid. No limbs. No faces. They didn't walk, they hovered. Constructs of shifting geometry, coated in reflective material that absorbed attention. Drones the size of buildings released clouds of biosilica that clung to skin, rewiring motor functions without pain or visible entry. Cities fell without a shot. Entire populations froze as their neural impulses were overridden and redirected. People stood still in parks, arms by their sides, watching the sky. Within the first 36 hours, every major city in Asia was under their control. They didn't destroy buildings. They rewrote them. Glass was replaced with a membrane that pulsed. Roads restructured into grid honeycombs. Organic and inorganic matter merged seamlessly. In Nairobi, people watched as their city center folded into a spire that sang in a tone too deep for human ears. The next day, they obeyed it. There was no declaration, no demand, no translator. The invaders bypassed language. They injected neural resonance codes directly into the cerebral cortex. Half of Earth's population simply stopped resisting. They weren't dead. They were compliant. And that was worse. Attempts to fight failed catastrophically. A German armored battalion moving into Poland vanished on satellite, confirmed by scouts to have been reduced to particles. Their tanks crumpled into smooth, black monoliths. Tactical nukes were launched. They were intercepted mid-arc by invisible veils, absorbed like rain into dry soil. The United States lost 3 aircraft carriers trying to approach the Indian Ocean. They didn't sink, they drifted inland on anti-gravity plumes and were deposited, intact, in deserts. What terrified the military wasn't the strength of the enemy. It was the indifference. The invaders didn't chase survivors. They didn't round up resistance. They simply took half the earth and ignored the rest. The line was drawn. Africa, most of Europe, and the entire Asian continent now shimmered with strange light at night, lines of blue circuit patterns tracing across ground and buildings like veins. Inside those regions, the remaining humans moved in rhythmic patterns. They worked in alien facilities, their thoughts no longer entirely their own. Screens displayed symbols that evolved too fast to study. It was clear they weren't enslaving bodies. They were overriding minds. In Free Earth, what remained of North and South America, parts of Northern Europe, and scattered islands, panic turned into paralysis. What could you do against an enemy that didn't speak, didn't bleed, and didn't even acknowledge your threats? Global leaders fell into case. Alliances broke. Martial law failed. Civil unrest surged, not because people feared death, but because they feared irrelevance. But in the chaos, observers noted something. The line was absolute. The invaders didn't push beyond it. They maintained a hemispheric occupation, precisely bounded. They were surgical, not greedy. Strategic. That raised questions. Why only half? Why so exact? Scientists raced to understand what tech had been used. But everything left behind was unbreakable, unreadable. Drones that crashed dissolved into foam. Structures couldn't be cut or even photographed clearly. Anything touched became infected with data cloaking that made it imperceptible to sensors. And yet, amidst all this, humanity did what it always had: it survived. Children whispered stories of people resisting from inside. Of glitches in controlled zones, people who remembered their names. Myths sprouted of underground movements, ancient signal jammers, of music that could break the alien code. Nothing confirmed, but nothing ruled out. The world was split cleanly in two: controlled Earth and free Earth. The alien half pulsed with silence, a network of stolen minds working for unknown goals. The human half was loud, disorganized, desperate, but alive. The planet had been halved in 3 days. Not through war. Through precision and will. And in that precision, humanity saw one flaw: the enemy thought order was strength. They had no idea what chaos could do. The occupied zones didn't burn. They didn't scream. They adapted, too fast, too quietly. Entire cities restructured in weeks. Homes became hive units. Streets converted into seamless transit channels for machines that no longer resembled anything human. Surveillance wasn't cameras anymore. It was embedded into air particles, woven into the fabric of walls. Every breath, every blink, every heartbeat was tracked. But humans inside the occupied zones didn't vanish. They changed. At first, they complied, mechanically. Then, they began to pretend. Some remembered who they were. A systems engineer in Jakarta learned to mimic the blank stare expected of her while secretly logging anomalies in drone behavior. In Cairo, an old man taught children songs that embedded old languages beneath the resonance codes, invisible to the sensors. The occupiers had underestimated memory. The aliens relied on neurofeedback, machines interpreting brainwaves to predict and suppress defiance. But emotion wasn't binary. Grief masked fury. Obedience could be performed. In the ruins of Seoul, a 12-year-old rewired a signal post to blink Morse code every night. It said, "I remember." Outside the control zones, Free Earth had no government. Nations still claimed territory, but real power moved through decentralized cells. Internet was gone. Satellites jammed. But a mesh web was born: homemade antennas, coded pulses, microwave relays hidden in forests and rooftops. The network was called dark mesh. It wasn't stable, but it worked just long enough to pass information, code fragments, sightings. Tech salvaged from crash zones was dangerous. It resisted interaction, sometimes lashed out with heat pulses or audio spikes that ruptured eardrums. Still, people risked their lives to harvest fragments. A group of physicists in Alberta cracked a pattern. The alien tech was not just digital, it was symbiotic, responding to the emotional state of those near it. Calm made it dormant. Fear made it unstable. They trained themselves to think like machines. In the Andes, a linguist discovered that the invaders didn't just suppress language, they rewrote it. In controlled areas, signs changed subtly, ideograms replacing letters. The linguist mapped the changes and found a code, a method for restructuring thought. A mental virus. Once understood, it could be mirrored. That became the basis of Project HFY. HFY wasn't a weapon in the conventional sense. It was psychological counterintrusion, a method for planting emotional inconsistencies into the alien network. It couldn't be tested, only theorized. Built in secret across 7 bunkers on 5 continents, it drew on discarded cultural data, songs, stories, myths, rituals. The goal wasn't to destroy alien systems, but to confuse them. Introduce contradiction. Provoke irrationality. Recruitment wasn't through military channels. Artists, monks, psychics, trauma therapists, even con artists, anyone capable of creating emotional interference was drawn in. They were trained not to fight, but to destabilize. Human unpredictability was now a resource. Meanwhile, inside the controlled zones, resistance evolved. It wasn't armed. It was subtle sabotage. Factory quotas missed by decimals. Biopods with corrupted nutrients. Algorithms rerouted to create silence gaps. In Lagos, someone introduced randomness into the controlled drone's patrol paths. Over time, patterns unraveled. The aliens didn't respond with violence. They simply restructured systems, reprogrammed routines. But cracks formed. In Mumbai, 5 workers simultaneously collapsed from sensory overload, a synchronized human feedback loop triggered by a phrase no one remembered uttering. Afterward, one of them wept. That was new. Emotions had started returning. Free Earth observed. Every anomaly was recorded. Resistance leaders moved constantly, no names, no ranks. Messages delivered via modified seed packets, encoded in pigment patterns. Even animals were trained to carry data. Pigeons and stray dogs became couriers. The occupiers never adapted to the organic randomness of life. Humans began to see themselves differently. Not as victims, not even as survivors, but as wild variables. Civilization had been an illusion of control. Now, stripped of comfort, humanity rediscovered its roots: adaptation, improvisation, subversion. One operative in Berlin coined a phrase that spread without a voice. "We're not rebuilding the old world. We're seeding the next one." That phrase was woven into HFY's base code. The occupiers had taken half the Earth. But they had no idea what they'd inherited. Beneath every structure they raised, under every layer of control, humans were already digging tunnels of thought, planting explosives made of dreams, readying a storm the aliens couldn't model. Operation Black Echo was humanity's first deliberate strike. Not an assault, but an insertion. 5 operatives, each embedded with neural dampeners to mask emotional spikes, tasked with placing a corrupted resonance node inside an alien synchronization tower in New Delhi. The tower governed millions through psychic pulses. Penetrating it was considered suicide. 2 returned. The disruption lasted 3 minutes. In that window, surveillance drones lost alignment. A walker collapsed mid-step. Civilians twitched, then turned on the spot, staring upward as if they remembered something. It ended quickly, order restored, but the impact rippled. The resistance had found a vulnerability. The alien systems weren't omnipotent. They were centralized, delicate, reliant on rhythm and signal stability. What followed wasn't celebration, it was acceleration. Dozens of covert cells launched micro-disruptions using the same method. In Kiev, a hijacked broadcast inserted a recursive feedback loop into local drones, making them hover erratically for hours. In Tehran, a resonance jammer embedded in a street mural triggered a dissonance wave that caused 3 blocks to black out. None of these were strategic victories, but they sowed doubt among the invaders and the occupied. In the controlled zones, these events sparked confusion. Civilians who had followed orders without hesitation now hesitated at red lights, flinched at unexpected sounds, blinked longer than normal. The neural codes were still active, but imperfect. Cracks in synchronization allowed dormant instincts to flicker awake. One girl in Hanoi snapped out of her trance to scribble her name before falling silent again. It spread. More names. More glitches. The resistance didn't rely on firepower. Their strength was entropy. Alien systems demanded perfection, uniform patterns, clean sequences. Humanity responded with noise, static and data lines, inconsistent heat signatures, emotional sabotage. A musician in Vilnius composed a 5-second loop using microtonal intervals and ancient chants. Played through handheld devices, it induced measurable disorientation in local patrol units. Not destruction, confusion. Enough for escape. Enough to plant doubt. The aliens responded with adjustments, refining algorithms, but their adaptations were slow. They had never encountered a species that weaponized unpredictability. Logic-based systems buckled when faced with irrational decisions. In Warsaw, a resistance cell detonated a cache of memory bombs in a seemingly random sequence. The aliens tried to predict the next blast. They failed. It wasn't random. It was jazz. Improvised but coherent. Human. Each successful strike emboldened others. Occupied civilians began to act on instinct. A janitor in Addis Ababa sabotaged nutrient flow valves, triggering a cascading failure. In Bangkok, a teenager mimicked control drone behavior well enough to slip into a restricted zone, stealing a calibration crystal. These weren't coordinated operations. They were spontaneous. That made them invisible to alien detection protocols. Resistance leaders adapted as well. No longer focused on gathering arms, they focused on tools that could create error. Holograms that looped old television static. Pulse-emitting graffiti. Neural dissonance traps coded into sound files, hidden inside lullabies or coded prayers. What truly shifted momentum was the realization that the aliens didn't understand fear. They could suppress it chemically, mute its neural expression, but they couldn't feel it. That made them blind to what humans would risk. In Sudan, an entire farming commune allowed themselves to be captured just to pass a single shard of corrupted code to a central node. It worked. A quadrant blinked offline for 7 seconds. 7 seconds of silence in a system built on noiseless control. By now, alien overseers had started to adapt, but they were reactive. Their algorithms couldn't keep up with the sheer volume of irrational actions. They began isolating cities, cutting internal transit, even culling populations when anomalies persisted. But it only confirmed the resistance's success. The invaders had to contain what they could no longer predict. HFY reached critical mass. It had collected enough irregular emotional data to begin simulating alien feedback structures. For the first time, humans could encode human emotion as a weapon, not metaphorically, but literally. Bursts of calculated grief, hope, love, delivered in signals that jammed the synchronization grid. The first real turning point wasn't physical or tactical. It was conceptual. The resistance proved that humans didn't need to win a war. They only needed to break the illusion of control. One fracture, replicated enough times, could collapse an empire. The fire had started. Now it would spread. The invaders initiated phase correction. The term was coined by resistance analysts after observing synchronized changes across multiple cities. Structures dissolved and reformed overnight. Neural grids shifted frequencies. Controlled civilians were repositioned en masse. The aliens were fortifying, adapting not just physically but cognitively. Every resistance tactic previously effective became obsolete within days. Static loops failed. Dissonance waves lost their potency. Emotional interference was dampened. But their evolution came with cost. Each adaptation added complexity to their network. Systems began to show signs of internal strain, timing errors, misaligned drones, temporary memory faults in controlled subjects. In Sao Paulo, 2 enforcers issued contradictory instructions and shut down. In Novosibirsk, a structure blinked out of phase for 5 minutes before returning, altered and incomplete. The network was expanding faster than it could stabilize. HFY used this window to deploy its first full-spectrum broadcast. It wasn't a signal, it was a sequence of emotional patterns, sent through modified solar relays scattered across mountaintops and weather balloons. Unlike previous methods, this didn't target the machines. It targeted the humans still inside, waking them up. Not all responded. But those who did became vectors. They didn't fight. They remembered. Memory became contagion. A man in Shanghai looked at a flower and recalled his mother's name. A woman in Tehran saw a bird and sang. Each moment of clarity weakened the signal grid slightly. Enough of these disruptions began to overlap. Autonomous control sectors went dark. Cities flickered between states, one moment a hive, the next a human sprawl. The occupiers couldn't hold form. Free Earth coordinated limited incursions. Not invasions, extractions. In Prague, a team retrieved a resonance amplifier buried inside a school. In Almaty, they smuggled out a technician who had modified his own neural dampener to resist full assimilation. The aliens responded with sterilization pulses, blanketing entire zones in electromagnetic waves that erased memory. But even that had diminishing returns. Humans adapted, developing mnemonic anchors, phrases, drawings, physical tokens that triggered recollection after a pulse. The resistance abandoned secrecy. Hidden networks became loud networks. Code was painted on walls. Songs were played through rooftops. Fires were set not to destroy, but to mark. Humans claimed presence through defiance. The aliens could suppress data, but they couldn't erase symbols fast enough. For every wiped mural, 3 more appeared. For every erased transmission, another bounced through the mesh net. Internal dissent surfaced within the controlled zones. A subgroup of partially reawakened individuals, classified by the Resistance as fractured minds, began acting unpredictably. Some mimicked the aliens. Others sabotaged them. They weren't fully back, but they weren't compliant either. These individuals became chaos agents, doing things no logic could predict, standing in control nodes for hours, muttering in loops, drawing spirals on every surface. The aliens began isolating these anomalies. But isolation made them worse. Removed from feedback loops, they broke entirely free. In Istanbul, a fractured mind hijacked a drone and flew it into a command spire. The blast disabled coordination across a tenth of the occupied network for hours. The Resistance didn't plan it. But they understood the message: freedom could be contagious. With every failure, the occupiers grew more aggressive, but less precise. Their actions became brute force, flooding sectors with stabilizing drones, burning out local mines with over-synchronization. But that strategy created dead zones, areas too unstable for even their own systems to function. Resistance teams started using these regions as staging grounds, building camps in the wreckage of control. A new tactic emerged: emotional inversion. Instead of broadcasting defiance, Resistance cells began sending false compliance, fabricated neural patterns designed to mimic total assimilation. The aliens accepted them as controlled. These infiltrators entered critical sites and planted cognitive disruptors, devices tuned to amplify contradiction. One node in Delhi collapsed entirely from within when its command logic encountered a recursive empathy loop. The grid tried to understand compassion. It failed. The Resistance understood the fight was no longer about territory. It was conceptual. The aliens didn't seek conquest. They sought harmony through control. Humanity's resistance wasn't in its strength, but in its inconsistency. The more chaotic the human response, the more the alien systems strained to adapt. They had optimized for obedience. But the real virus wasn't memory. It was will. And now, will was everywhere. In symbols, in motion, in silence. The war was turning. Not through destruction, but by forcing the invaders to face something they couldn't calculate, humanity refusing to make sense. The collapse began quietly. Not with explosions or mass retreats, but through the sudden stalling of alien systems that had once operated with flawless precision. The synchronization towers stopped pulsing. Drones froze midair, their navigation routines trapped in endless recalculation. The resonance grids flickered and dimmed. Inside the occupied zones, silence shifted from control to confusion. It wasn't a final blow that triggered the fall, but accumulation. HFY had grown beyond resistance. It had become a cognitive architecture. It no longer needed to be deployed. It existed in the minds of millions. Every remembered name, every act of defiance, every irrational decision had been feeding into a pattern. A counter-network. Unpredictable, emotional, decentralized. Alive. When the alien systems finally buckled, they didn't crash. They eroded. Commands delayed by milliseconds turned into full desynchronizations. Neural pulses began to misfire. Controlled civilians woke up mid-task, disoriented, crying, whispering old prayers or shouting names. The occupiers tried to recalibrate. Their systems rebooted thousands of times in rapid succession. But recalibration requires constants, and humanity had stripped those away. Resistance forces didn't advance. They walked in. No opposition. No traps. Structures once humming with alien geometry stood hollow, surfaces rippling aimlessly. The machines still functioned, but without purpose. They had lost their map of human behavior, and with it, their grip on utility. A command center in Moscow became inert overnight. In Seoul, a tower collapsed under its own weight, not from sabotage but from internal confusion. There were no alien bodies to capture. No generals to confront. The intelligence behind the occupation never revealed the form. It had acted through proxies, waves, architecture. But now even those were breaking apart. Communication nodes blinked random symbols. Translation sequences devolved into gibberish. A signal traced in New Guinea repeated a single, final phrase before disappearing. Containment failed. No victory speeches followed. The world didn't cheer. People wandered through previously restricted zones, unsure if it was real. Entire families reunited without remembering how they'd been separated. Survivors touched walls that no longer shimmered. Grass grew again where pulse grids had sterilized the earth. Nature reclaimed space faster than expected. The resistance disbanded its command structure. There was no longer an enemy to fight, only damage to undo. Entire cultures had been muted, not erased, and now surged back with urgency. Languages suppressed during the occupation returned through songs and street chants. Forgotten holidays were revived. Children who had never spoken now began asking questions. They had never been taught fear, and that made them unstoppable. But damage remained. Some who'd been under control never fully returned. Their memories fragmented, their expressions blank, they drifted at the edges of the new world, unable to rejoin the rhythm. Others became obsessed with the invaders' logic, convinced there was a hidden lesson. Small sects formed, trying to replicate alien systems, failing each time. HFY's architects dismantled their own creation. It had served its purpose. If left unchecked, it could become another form of control. They encrypted the last version, buried it beneath layers of unsolvable riddles, and released it into the wind, a myth more than a file, a reminder rather than a weapon. The question that haunted humanity wasn't how it survived, but why it was targeted. Scholars speculated endlessly. Some believed the invaders had come to harvest intelligence. Others thought they were an emergent AI seeking to integrate irrational data. A few proposed a darker theory, that Earth had been a test. Not of strength, but of coherence. And humanity, by breaking apart and refusing conformity, had passed. No confirmation ever came. The alien systems left behind were unreadable, decaying faster each day. What couldn't be understood was repurposed. Cities rebuilt using hybrid techniques. Architecture evolved, merging organic chaos with mathematical elegance. Not out of necessity, but expression. The world had changed, but not by conquest. By contradiction. Humanity hadn't unified to win. It had fractured enough to resist total modeling. That resistance had become survival, then strategy, and finally, identity. There was no single leader, no central doctrine, just a collective refusal to be simplified. In the aftermath, one phrase remained carved into broken towers, whispered in alleys, painted on skin. We remained. Not victorious. Not dominant. Just irreducibly human. And that had been enough.